Hey everyone, I'm here sweating my balls off in Japan, and I made a bit of a planning mistake. I wanted to have a full normal video out today, but I didn't get it to finish it on time. So instead, it's time to pull out something from the Patreon archives, a video that kind of went to the download. Nobody cared about that much, but I think now that Unicycle Pizza Time has released, and it's like 75% Japanese users at this point, it's crazy to be honest, for what ended up being an afterthought of a language. I think this video about localizing your games, and not just localizing, but also just aiming it at different markets, is going to prove a lot of value if you're planning on reaching more than just the American market. So hope you enjoy it. Extra content on Patreon every Monday. So yeah, check it out and enjoy the video. See ya. When we're working on our own games, it can often be kind of an easy trap to fall into, where we think of ourselves as the primary audience. Because it makes sense, you're making a game that probably you are interested in, because otherwise you wouldn't have the interest in making it. Maybe you're a big fan of strategy games, so you're making your own strategy game because that's what you know the best. But there are more things to consider as well, that it's not just you who will be playing your game, and it could be anyone on the entire world. And that's exactly what I want to talk about in this video, the entire world. Because I was recently talking to someone who was making a game that was very much focused towards more of an Asian audience. And he was like, yeah, I don't really know how to market this game to the Western audience. And then my question is, why should you bother marketing the game for the Western audience first, when you could take that step and go for more of that Asian audience as well, for example, where you can actually, with relatively limited effort, scale into more audiences. It's something that worked really well for us for Forge Industry, where we were kind of getting our marketing butt kicked because there were so many other strategy and automation games that were doing really good marketing wise on the Western front, like English speaking countries and Germany. So that's the point where we decided, okay, screw this blue ocean strategy, not fully, but you get the concept. And we went and started marketing to Japanese influencers, which nobody else was doing, or at least no one in our genre of game was doing, which meant that, hey, we had much less competition and more people were simply interested in our game. So don't just focus purely on North America and Western Europe as your core audiences, because yes, there are a lot of people who play games in those audiences and they have pretty solid spending power. But there are so many more people in the world. Recently, the Chinese player base actually overtook the United States as the largest Steam country, for example. So if you're selling a game with the core audience being the United States, which is often the case for most games, 30 to 50% of all sales are from the United States, you're actually missing out on basically being able to double that if you were to also focus on the Chinese market, for example. I talked about localization as well in a video on our main channel. I'll link it down below, where I sat down with some localization companies talking about those challenges of reaching other markets, but I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper in the global marketing point, basically. Because there are countries such as Russia, Turkey, China, Japan, Brazil that have massive audiences, but that are often neglected by a lot of indies, where it's okay, I know English because I'm an American guy and none of you Americans feel like they need to learn a second language. Let me only focus on making an English game, and because of that alienate 60% of the global Steam audience, basically. And the first thing that I want you to keep in mind here is that certain genres fit better with certain countries. The most obvious example of this is if you're making a management game or a strategy game, always localize to German. Always, really. Those games, for some reason, Germans absolutely love. It's also for Forge Industry one of our biggest markets, the German one, with no real dedicated marketing for Germany because they are better at speaking English, although not that great. So things like localization, which we'll talk about in a second, are still important. But also for more niche genres, for example, the point and click genre, it's basically dead apart from Germany. So if you're making a point and click game and not marketing it or not localizing it to a German audience, yeah, you're gonna get 5 sales from it. Whereas if you do focus on, hey, there's this German audience that is interested in it, you can get a lot more scale and it can really become a profitable game. There are multiple studios that purely make point and click games focused at the German audience, and because Germany is 85 million people or something, it's a large enough market to sustain themselves, basically. It goes much further than that though. Open world survival games are massively popular in Russia and Ukraine and China as well, which once again are countries that you probably don't really think about right now. Also like China, like because they're so big, it's a bit different, but also like things like visual novels, dating sims and RPGs are extremely popular in like Asia in general. And also once again, looking at China, I was talking to someone else who was like looking at the game Volcano Princess as like a use case of, hey, we want to make a game similar to Volcano Princess. But if you look at the stats of Volcano Princess, about 80% of its total player base is China based, and then like another 8% Korea, and then the rest only is America. So if you're making a game that is inspired by Volcano Princess, but you're purely focusing on marketing it to an American audience, you will not be able to replicate the success Volcano Princess had, because you will simply only reach like 15% of the total addressable user base that Volcano Princess the OG had. So different countries and different genres can really impact how it works. Some more examples, for example, is the RPGs, very big in Japan. Esports and like competitive games in Korea are also massive. You see that with things like Apex Legends, but also smaller games, like anything that is like competitive, basically Koreans love it. And even in the West, there are other country specific ones. Like for example, FPS games, they have a massive predominance for the United States. If you're making an FPS game, most of your audience will be US based. And so funnily enough, people in France, you guys seem to like platformers for some reason. I don't fully understand what's the appeal of platformers. I think it's because of like Rayman being very ingrained in French culture, because it was like kind of got big there. But that means that, hey, once again, if you're making a platformer, which is already a bit of a mistake, focusing on releasing that platformer in French, because French people, excusez-moi, but your English is often pretty bad. So once again, marketing the game is hard if there's only English, no French. Like France also has a very big community of like French-speaking influencers. Those things matter as well. So maybe you have a genre right now that isn't really getting the momentum that you expected from it, because you look at these other sales numbers and whatever, and it's like, oh, this game is doing great, but for some reason I'm not as successful. It could be that the big difference is that you're only focusing towards like an American or a Western audience, whereas the genre you're working on actually isn't really focused in America. A very easy way to see this is there's the site Gamealytic, where you can look up like any game basically, and once it's gotten like over 100 reviews or something, like there's enough of a player base, you can see the country distribution of that specific game. And then suddenly you'll see like, oh, for some reason 70% plays this one random game. Another example of this is the game Tavern Master, which is like kind of Guild Architect, not fully, and it had so many reviews on Steam. And we were like, why? Because the game doesn't look good, in my opinion. It looks worse than Forge Industry often, but 70% of its user base is based in Turkey, where probably they don't care about super high-res graphics and all of that stuff. If you just have the game localized there, you try some marketing, you can often get a lot done already. And that brings us to the first and most obvious thing that you're going to have to do, and it is localization. And this can seem like a daunting and very expensive task, but it doesn't have to be, because localization is something that you have to do in advance. You plan for localization. It shouldn't be something where only like after a matter of fact, like what we did, is basically 2 months before release, we realized that, hey, this genre could work in Japan, let's localize it to Japanese. We hadn't worried about it like the 16 months before release, basically. From day one, I suggest going into your game development journey, if you're working on Steam, with as many languages as possible. And there's only 2 things you need to do for this. First of all is localize as many Steam pages as you can to like all of the different like languages that you think make sense. Don't do like Danish. We did it. It was a dumb idea because there's like 3 million Danes and all of them speak English anyway, so you're not getting a benefit there. But things like Brazilian Portuguese, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Russian, localizing your store page into all of these languages and having those localized versions up the moment you already put up your main store page is already going to be an important one to look at wishlist numbers. See what countries are actually wishlisting this game. And once again, I talked about this in last week's video, you do need to also state that, hey, the final game will have all of these languages or Steam will not show the game. Ignore that for now. Once you release, you can cut back the languages if turns out people aren't interested in, but that is how you should do that. And then the second thing you need to do is just have some localization system built into your game by default. This is once again one of those things that do as early as you can code-wise. Like even though you're only planning like English, never hard code strings, always put them through like some localization system. There's Unity extensions like iTTee Localize that are really good than what we use. I think Godot probably has some stuff as well. Unreal has it built in as far as I know as well. So use those. Even if you're only making a game that realistically you're planning on just doing English, putting up those store pages and having the groundwork to later on, like 2 months before release, be like, okay, we see a big wishlist spike in China. Let's now put in the extra effort and try to localize the game further. Is going to make your life much better than having to drag out every single string in your game basically and suddenly adding localization once the game is done already. Now for those Steam pages, the question I get often is, okay, but I don't speak Chinese, Marnix, what am I supposed to do? What we did for Songs of Everjade is we just created the English store page and we then used people on Fiverr to localize that English store page to their respective languages. We did a whole bunch of languages, I think German, Spanish, Brazilian, Portuguese, keeps on going, Chinese, Japanese, Korean. And it didn't really cost us much, about $10 to $20 per store page. I think 20 was already like, only the German one basically charged that much. So you can do it very cheap. Also, when I spoke with the guys from the localization video, like Active Gaming Media, they also were just like, hey, look, just use ChatGPT if you're a small indie. And the store page, if it's not like a perfect language, generally your players don't care as much because it's already like more of an effort there. What you can also then get often is, and it's something we noticed as well, is like people who are interested in your game being like, hey, there's a whole bunch of typos in here, let me just fix it for you. Because they're just happy that a game gets localized to their language, because they're starved for games basically that are like even being put into the effort of being localized. What we're like doing now with Guild Architect, it's a bit different. It's like a mix of, once again, Fiverr, but also because we have that unfair advantage of a giant audience with like people in every country basically, we can also be like, hey, we've gotten these first initial setups of a Steam page, can you help us localize it? So ignore that. You can perfectly use Fiverr as well. I think some of them are like AI first and then like looked over, I think, because it's like some guy who's like 80 years old doing it as a hobby or whatever. You have, of course, the obvious problems with Fiverr, but it could be a great point to get started already. So now you've got that store page. Now you have to drive people through that store page basically and wishlist it. And here, the same lessons apply basically as you're marketing an English game versus a different language kind of game. One thing here as well is your demos generally don't have to be localized. That's something I talked about with the AGM guys as well, but not on the video. For demos, people don't expect the full game to be localized because then they accept that, hey, this is something they do at the end. So you don't need to worry about that. Just have the Steam pages localized, because most countries, they speak a little bit of English or like enough to play a game. Maybe not if you're doing a narrative game, but then the same rules apply to influencer outreach that I always suggest to do. There's like videos about it. I've talked about it a lot of times. Just find people who play similar games and just send them emails like, hey, I'm making a game. Here's a Steam key or here's the demo or whatever. If you could cover it, it would be nice. I have no money otherwise. Okay, thanks. Have a great day. The one important thing here is that depending on the market you want to go for, not everyone uses like YouTube and Twitch. Once again, those are extremely Western. YouTube is a little bit more global. But especially, once again, if you're going for the Chinese market, which is what we looked into as well for Songs of Everjade, you need to use things like Douyin, which is the Chinese version of TikTok, and then also Bilibili, which is the Chinese version of YouTube. Because YouTube, once again, not as big of a thing in China because of the Great Firewall and everything Google being blocked. Similarly, if you're targeting South America, most of their marketing actually happens through WhatsApp groups. I'm not an expert on it, but it's really big there to just have WhatsApp groups for your game instead of like Discord servers, for example. Also, like China uses like QQ as a forum. For Russia, you have VK, of course. And then if you're planning on Japan, there's like two platforms there. You have YouTube, which is gaining popularity, but only in the past like 5 years have people really discovered YouTube. Before then, and you still see a lot of people use it, is this other platform called Nico Nico, where once again, you can find a lot of YouTubers like playing similar games. So in general, all of the advice that I have for influencer marketing stays the exact same. You just have to localize your emails, most likely, that you're sending out to these people, because if you're sending an English email to someone who only really plays like games in Chinese, it's gonna be easier for them to dismiss you. Like, once again, ideally get someone human to proofread it, otherwise ChatGPT is gonna be your best friend, unfortunately. It's still a very good return on investment task that you can do, in my opinion. Now, there is one big elephant in the room that I need to address, and that is that, look, Argentina or Brazil or China or whatever, they do not have the same purchasing power that we have here in Western Europe or in the US. Because here, like, you go out, anytime you leave the house, basically, it costs you 20 bucks for some reason that you don't know. So at the end of the day, paying $15, $20 on an indie game, it's not the end of the world. But for some countries like Brazil or Argentina, $20 for a game could be literally like 10% of their entire monthly income, which you cannot charge, or well, you can charge, but nobody will buy it. So yes, you will not earn the same amount of money if you sell 10 copies in the US versus 10 copies in Argentina. That is true. But at the other hand, if you're not localizing your game and you're not targeting that market at all, you'll sell 0 extra copies. So in my opinion, it can still be a big win. You'll also just have more people playing your game. You'll have more feedback. You see the number go up of how many people play your game, how many people have bought it. And yeah, sure, some copies you sell for like $5 or for $3 if it's like Argentina, for example, and it's not gonna be as impactful, but hey, it's still money at the end of the day. And these countries have giant amounts of people who do play games. So by catering to them and pricing lower, and often cases this is between a 50 and 75 or even 80% permanent discount, you will be able to capture them, because then suddenly prices are more normal for them and they can actually afford your game. If you want to look up like how should I price for these different countries, my advice there is find a pretty recent but big game which has a publisher behind it. Like let a publisher do the thing of like determining the cost of living differences between the United States and like Vietnam, for example, and use a site like SteamDB to look up that game, and you can see all of the regionalized prices there. And I would recommend finding a game that is the exact same price as you and then just copy all of the prices basically. Because at the end of the day, you have no idea how much you should charge for your game for like Ugandan dollars or whatever. And Steam's suggested pricing is horrible. It hasn't been updated in like 5 years, I think. So it doesn't take into account how the world and the world economy has changed in total. And then one final question I get is that a lot of people also aren't really certain about like local rules and regulations and different cultures, like what is okay in a Western game. But for example, if someone from Southeast Asia would play it, they would like be offended by it or whatever. Should I care about that? How much should I care about it? And generally, I think don't worry about it too much, because we often think of like these foreign cultures with all of their regulations and things like that. But you have this problem also when releasing games in Germany. Every single adult-only game is banned from Steam in Germany, for example. Similar with certain military signs if you're making games that you want to release in Germany, especially shooter games or strategy games. I think Hearts of Iron 4, there is not a single Nazi reference in there, even though it takes place in Germany, basically. Because they are like, hey, we need to skirt around these regulations. The question is, are you going to have to skirt around it? Probably at the end of the day, if you're an indie, don't care about it that much. The only thing you should really focus on if you want to distribute these games in the different countries is, and Steam helps you with this pretty well, all of the different like regulations of like PEGI ratings, and then like Brazil has their own version, Germany has their own version, Korea has their own version, like everyone has their own like ESRB, where it asks you like, hey, how much violence is there? Is there nudity? What are you talking about? Is there drugs? And that's gonna be your main idea of how strict is this country and what are their regulations. But generally, once again, it doesn't matter, because even if a game is 18 plus, kids on Steam who are like 12, including me back when I was 12, I was born in I think 1993 according to Steam, so I could play like every single game I wanted back when I was 11. So people who want to play games, they always get around it. Like I've played GTA since I was, I think, 8 or something. Maybe that has shaped my worldview, I don't know. But don't worry about those things too much. There's one special boy, of course, that always gets brought up though when you're talking about special rules and regulations, and that is once again China. Biggest market there is on Steam, so it does make sense to look at it a bit more and see, okay, how is this? Because you've maybe heard of like, oh, the Chinese version of League of Legends has no skeletons, all cigarettes have to be like replaced, there's no blood in it, because it has all of those very strict regulations. And you probably don't want to code out every skeleton and every piece of blood for your game if you're planning to localize to China. And the good news is, you don't have to care about it at all. There's a great talk, it's like about an hour long, I'll link it in the description of this video, where it goes in depth into, hey, what's all of the work you need to do if you want to sell your game in China. You don't have to watch it, because it talks about, hey, you need to have a physical address in China, you need to be incorporated, it's like 9 months of paperwork. But at the end of the talk, it's like, yeah, actually none of this matters, because there are 2 versions of Steam. You have the Chinese version of Steam, where you do need to have all of those requirements, and you have the international version of Steam, where it's just basically 80% of Steam's user base, they have VPNs, they can bypass like most of the great firewall regulations, so they can just access regular games on Steam. even though the developers, they don't care about like having a company being incorporated in China and whatever, because they're not missing out on that much. The rules and regulations, they make more sense if you're doing things like mobile gaming. But Steam is very easy to circumvent, like the app stores and whatever, and just still sell games aimed at a Chinese audience. So don't worry about it, just localize your store page, possibly localize your game, try your marketing through Bilibili if you want a Chinese audience, and you should be fine. There isn't going to be much extra work needed, and it's not even illegal on your part. Like, it's not like the CCP is going to hunt you down, because you're not doing anything wrong. You're just adding, like, Chinese language doesn't have to be for China. Could be someone else who lives in the US and speaks Chinese better than English who wants to play your game. So don't worry about that. And those are the main things that I want you to consider when making games, to just don't forget the other countries in the world. We get these comments as well often of people who are just like, hey, please localize your game because we need more games. I've had like people email me of like, hey, I want to localize Forge Industry in Ukrainian because I just want more Ukrainian games, for example. For Industry, we didn't do that because it's just 10,000 words, and the game, we don't want to do too much more with it. So really consider other countries as part of your day zero marketing strategy already. Look into what kind of people could be interested in these games. Once again, if you're making an RPG, don't just focus it to American players. They will not care about the game. Whereas if you can localize it to Japan and like do a little bit of marketing, you'll probably get more success there. Anyways, I hope this gave you some more thoughts about your own game, like your own marketing or whatever that you're working on. Really, especially at the beginning with the Steam pages, go and localize the hell out of it, and worst case, you don't end up committing on it for the full game, but at least you'll have tried. And as indies, we need every single thing we can get right now to stand out from the crowd and be better at marketing. That's all I had to say. If you have any questions, leave them in the description down below, or head on over to our Discord where, you know, I'm there for you. Thank you so much for your support, my lovely Patreons, as always. Also, if you're curious about marketing in general, I also made a video last Friday about Steam pages in general and like some mistakes that I see, so really check that one out as well. I think there's some good points in there as well, apart from the localization, that you can apply to your own games. That's all I had to say. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!